So if Chapter 1 was all about documenting a complete internal collapse, then Chapter 2 is where the construction of a new mental framework really begins. The chaos starts to give way to a calm, systematic line of reasoning. You could say this is the very foundation of clarity.
All right, so remember where we left Arjuna. He's on this battlefield, but he's not the great warrior we know him as. He's a man who is completely broken. His bow is on the ground, he's trembling, his mind is just completely overwhelmed by this profound grief, to the point of total absolute paralysis.
Now, after an entire chapter of Krishna, his guide, staying completely silent, the teaching is finally triggered by this one single moment. It's when Arjuna just admits it. I'm completely confused. He formally surrenders as a student, and that breakdown, that's the necessary catalyst. That's what gets the whole dialogue started.
And this brings us right to the first big idea of the chapter, understanding the anatomy of clarity itself.
So you have to ask the question, right? Why now? Why does Krishna wait until Arjuna hits this absolute rock bottom, this point of total despair, before he says a single word of instruction?
Well, the answer is, it's absolutely foundational. Total confusion isn't seen as a failure here. It's actually the necessary entry point. Think about it. Only when all your old certainties, all your previous ways of thinking have been completely shattered, only then is there enough empty space to build a new, much more resilient mental architecture.
And so, Krishna begins. But here's the thing. He doesn't start with sympathy or some kind of emotional comfort. Nope. He starts with a very stark, very intellectual distinction. The self versus the body.
What's so interesting here is how this whole approach just bypasses emotion entirely. Krishna's first move isn't to console Arjuna, it's to reframe the whole problem logically. He basically sets up two distinct categories. On one hand, you have the body. It's temporary, it's perishable, it's always subject to change. And on the other hand, you have the self, the Atma, which is described as the complete opposite, eternal, unchanging, and fundamentally indestructible. And this isn't presented as something you just have to believe, like a statement of faith. It's laid out as a primary principle. The argument is actually quite simple. Arjuna is grieving for something that is, by its very nature, temporary. His whole focus is on the body, so he's basically misplacing his concern. The core of a person, that indwelling self, that's the part that can't be touched by a sword.
This next idea really drives the point home with a powerful analogy. It takes this abstract concept of transition and makes it super simple and logical. Death gets reframed. It's not some terrifying final end. Instead, it's like a person changing their clothes. The eternal self is just shedding a worn-out body for a new one. It's a really potent metaphor, and it's designed specifically to dissolve that core fear of being annihilated.
So, once you reframe the self like that, it leads you directly to the next big idea, a completely new definition of what loss even means.
I mean, this is the direct logical consequence, right? If you accept the premise that the self is eternal and indestructible, then death can't be the ultimate tragedy anymore. It gets reframed as more of a procedural event. It's simply a change of form.
So if you follow that logic, then from this perspective, grief is fundamentally a perceptual error. It's the emotional pain you feel when you mistake the temporary garment, the body, for the actual person, the eternal self. The suffering, when you get right down to it, is rooted in a cognitive mistake.
Okay, so with this new intellectual foundation firmly in place, Krishna introduces the next component of this, let's call it a mental operating system. And that is a new principle for how to act.
And the instruction here is very precise. Arjuna isn't being told not to act. He's being told to perform his duty, but to do it from a completely different state of mind. He still has to act with his full skill and commitment, but, and this is the real key, he has to completely let go of his emotional attachment to the outcome. All that anxiety about whether he'll win or lose, that has to be abandoned.
Now, it's really important to see that this is just planting a seed, right? It's the beginning of a much larger idea that's going to be developed throughout the whole text, but it's introduced right here as the practical method for operating in the world. It's the direct answer to that big question, okay, so how should I live, knowing that the self is eternal?
So what's the goal of all this then? What kind of person is this philosophy trying to cultivate? Well, Krishna wraps up the chapter by describing the ideal psychological state, what he calls the mark of a steady mind.
This individual, who's called a Sthitaprajna, is basically defined by their profound psychological stability. Their satisfaction comes from the inside, from the self, not from what happens externally or from getting validation. They aren't destroyed by sorrow, but they also don't desperately cling to pleasure. They're just free from those compulsive drives of attachment, fear, and anger.
And look, this isn't presented as some instant mystical state you just achieve overnight. It's the psychological end goal. It's that state of resilience, of emotional intelligence that this whole mental framework is designed to build, piece by piece, principle by principle. It's that deep stability that comes when a person is truly, truly grounded.
So let's just take a moment and reflect on the shift that's happened here. From the end of Chapter 1 to the end of Chapter 2, the change is absolutely monumental. So the question is, what fundamentally has really changed?
Well, Arjuna's emotional storm, that state of complete paralysis, it wasn't met with empty assurances. It was met with the first principles of a logical, systematic philosophy. All the chaos from Chapter 1 has now been replaced by the solid, intellectual structure of Chapter 2. The foundation for clarity has officially been laid, and it provides a rational framework for navigating pretty much any crisis where your duty and your despair collide.